So it looks like NATO has been cleared hot to shoot down Russian aircraft that violate NATO airspace. Here's what President Trump had to say about that just a few moments ago at the United Nations.
Any questions?
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
Good. Those are positive comments. I think that's the direction we should move in, and I've talked about it in recent videos. These continued tests by Russia to see how the NATO alliance stands up, whether it's 1 or 2 drones into multiple Baltic states, 19 drones in one wave launched into Poland a little over a week ago, and then last week, 3 manned Russian fighter jets flying through Estonian airspace for 12 minutes. They are testing. Yesterday, by the way, there appear to be more drones flying over Copenhagen and Denmark. Still waiting on some details on that one, but Copenhagen has said, or Denmark has said, they are not ruling out the possibility that those were Russian drones. These tests need to be met with strength, and I like the direction that President Trump is going with this. We'll see if it actually translates to any real action on the ground. And something I want to say is NATO shooting down Russian aircraft that is testing and violating NATO airspace is not an escalation. It is the opposite. It is de-escalating this situation, which might sound contradictory. Russia continues to try to press the boundaries forward and figure out how many lines can they cross before there's actually repercussions. NATO needs to stand firm like they have for decades upon decades. There is no line to cross here. Any entrance by Russian military aircraft, missiles, drones, or any munition into NATO airspace will be shot down, full stop, end of story. Show Russia that we are not messing around. The NATO alliance is taking these threats seriously. Now, we're going to run through a bunch of clips from the United Nations General Assembly today, some statements from President Trump on the floor, other one-off meetings with world leaders. It's a roller coaster. Just get ready. Up, down, and sideways in every direction. I'm not entirely certain anything has been clarified from these remarks, but it is worth checking in and seeing where some of these things stand. So following up with President Trump's statements there sitting by Ukrainian President Zelensky, after he said he would be on board with NATO shooting down Russian aircraft, he was asked, would you back NATO? Which I think is actually a very fair question for reporters to ask. Unfortunately, but I'm glad they asked it. Here we go.
Would you back up NATO allies? You said that you thought that they should shoot down the Russian aircraft. Would you back them up? Would the United States help them out in some way?
Depends on the circumstance, but, we're very strong toward NATO. NATO has stepped up. When they went from 2% to 5%, that was great unity. Trillions of dollars is being pumped in, and they're paying us for the weapons that we send. But that was a big day. That nobody thought a thing like that could happen. You had countries that weren't paying 2%, and now they're all paying 5%. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of weapons they're buying, and they're buying them from us.
Again, I think this was the right answer. Good for President Trump. This is the right way to lay this out. First off, I think it's very, very important these days to just say the words that we are a part of NATO, that we stand with our NATO alliance member states. I think that's an important message to simply say. I don't think it's just understood anymore. Putin especially is watching to see, does the United States continue to use this language that we will stand with our NATO partners? So that by itself, great. Love seeing that from the president. His comments about it depends on the circumstance is not wishy-washy. That is a very smart comment that actually lines up with U.S. policy, every country's policy towards NATO. That's just the way it is. We don't automatically, start engaging Russian military assets because NATO. We all are independent sovereign states and all act in our own self-interest. And just because a NATO member state is engaged in a conflict with Russia does not automatically mean that the U.S. is going to take a particular action, right? So no matter what the circumstance is that violates, in this case, NATO airspace, the appropriate response is it depends on the situation what we're going to do. I like it. Look, I know that there's a more hawkish view of, no matter what, we are going to be there. We're going to back them up, full stop, end of story. I think he got that across here while still making clear that, we cannot be pulled into a conflict. That's not how the NATO alliance works. Article 5 cannot force the United States into a war because of that right there. It's dependent on the situation. I think that was a pretty solid response from the president. Now, he was asked about the ongoing incursions into NATO airspace. Yesterday, we played some clips from the Polish foreign minister essentially threatening Russia, saying, this is your last warning. as well as the vice president of the European Union, and then the foreign minister of Latvia speaking for Latvia and Lithuania, talking about how much of an issue these Russian incursions into NATO airspace have been. So that's been a top-of-mind item for a lot of people across the NATO alliance. My argument recently is it doesn't seem like it's getting a lot of attention here. I think the president confirms that when he is asked about these these possible Russian incursions into Denmark yesterday. Here's his answer.
Mr. President, have you been briefed on the latest alleged drone incursion into Denmark? What do you think of that? And
Where are they?
Into Denmark, Copenhagen. Denmark is saying that there were some drones at the airport, possibly Russian sabotage. What's your response to that? Will the U.S. have a material?
Well, I have no response until I find out exactly what happened. I know about it, but they don't know what happened. But we're going to find out very soon.
Sir.
So again, just kind of bringing to the forefront here, it is still under investigation. The last I saw from Denmark is they are still looking into what exactly played out here. But the idea that a possible Russian incursion into another NATO member state, by the way, it looks like there were some Russian ships nearby and these drones may have been launched off of there. But again, the investigation is ongoing. The fact that that is not a top priority briefing issue for the President of the United States, I think says a lot about where our priorities are right now. I would argue that that's not good, but it is just kind of where the situation sits. Now, we're seeing a lot of what I would argue are positive points here made by the president. I'm going to rope you back to earth here real quick. I'm sorry, we got to do it. We got to include the good, the bad, and the ugly. President Trump was asked, do you trust Putin? And you probably know the answer to that before we play the clip, but let's go for it.
Any update on your talks with President Putin, and do you still trust him?
I'll let you know in about a month from now, okay?
Son of a bitch. We used to do 2 weeks. Now it's a month, and it's always just kicked down the road. So again, we've got some, I think, positive developments, if nothing else, saying that we are a part of NATO and we stand with our NATO allies, I think is a really important thing to hear right now. But we're back to the 3 weeks, a month before not even any action is taken with Russia, just to determine whether or not we actually trust Putin. Another month to figure out if he's trustworthy. And I don't want to let it slide that we are a full month after the meeting in Washington, D.C. between a lot of NATO member states and President Zelensky and the head of NATO talking about organizing a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. That was a month ago. Remember, it was like in the works. It was going to happen. It's just completely out of the conversation at this point. It did not happen whatsoever, and we moved on to the next thing. Now, President Trump did make some comments that are worth diving into on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. That speech went for an hour. Most people were talking like 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes, an hour. He hit everything. We're going to try to just pull out the ones that are relevant to specifically, in this case, Russia and Ukraine. But before diving into that, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. So here's a fun little story for you. A few weeks ago, a company called Healthcare Services Group announced that a data breach had exposed the personal and health information of 624,000 people. That breach was in September of 2024. And great, they made it public, so now their employees and customers can take the necessary action, but it's a full year after their information was leaked. And I hope they do, and I hope they get it cleaned up, but here's the deal. You can't wait until your data has been compromised to take action, because to some degree, it's happening all the time. It's not always big breaches like this, but even smaller data brokers that purchase your information online and sell your profile to anyone, no questions asked. With access to this data, bad actors can piece together a profile of where you live, job, income, religious or political affiliation, and more. I don't think very many people want that information just floating around out there. I certainly don't. And this is where tools like Delete Me come in. Delete Me is a subscription service that constantly scans the internet, and when they find your personal data available for sale, they have it removed. I use Delete Me, and here's a look at my most recent report where they reviewed 3,935 listings, found and removed 11 listings with 11 different data brokers that contained 120 pieces of my personally identifiable information. And look at last month, only 2 listings removed. That's why the subscription aspect here is so important. This is the kind of thing that isn't one and done. You've got to stay on top of it, or like I prefer, have Delete Me stay on top of it for you. So if you want to protect yourself and your family from these data brokers, get started today. Scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in the description, and be sure to use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. And of course, thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. All right, so again, we've got an hour-long speech at the UN General Assembly. If you want to listen to it, go for it. It touched on everything, seriously, like everything, not just foreign affairs or UN related, but a lot of domestic issues as well. It's kind of a pretty normal Trump speech in that regard. But he did make some interesting comments here talking about how the war that's going on right now is making Russia look bad.
Always been a good one. I thought that was going to be the easiest one. But, in war, you never know what's going to happen. There are always lots of surprises, both good and bad. Everyone thought Russia would win this war in 3 days. But it didn't work out that way. It was supposed to be just a quick little skirmish. It's not making Russia look good. It's making them look bad. No matter what happens from here on out, this was something that should have taken a matter of days, certainly less than a week. And they've been fighting for 3.5 years.
Now, that was a part of the president talking about how many wars he has ended in the last few months, and how he expected the Russia-Ukraine war to be faster or easier to end because of his previous relationship with Vladimir Putin. But he, of course, has not been able to bring that to a close. There has been a little more pressure. I'm seeing in a couple different news outlets asking specifically Secretary of State Marco Rubio about this. This is still going on. The president talked about one day he's going to end it as soon as he comes into office. Of course, we're not there. And as the earlier clip mentioned, it looks like we're another month away from any sort of real talks or even finding out if Putin is trustworthy or not. Now, one thing President Trump did hit on here that should not have been a surprise to anybody is saying we need Europe to step up and do more, specifically hammering on Europe for their continued use of Russian oil and energy resources. And he said, if Europe actually carries through with some of these, we are ready to layer massive sanctions on Russia that he thinks could be big enough to actually end the war entirely. Here we go.
This war would never have started if I were president. This was a war that should have never happened. It shows you what leadership is, what bad leadership can do to a country. Look what happened to the United States, and look where we are right now in just a short period of time. The only question now is how many more lives will be needlessly lost on both sides. China and India are the primary funders of the ongoing war by continuing to purchase Russian oil. But inexcusably, even NATO countries have not cut off much Russian energy and Russian energy products, which, as you know, I found out about 2 weeks ago, and I wasn't happy. Think of it. They're funding the war against themselves. Who the hell ever heard of that one? In the event that Russia is not ready to make a deal to end the war, then the United States is fully prepared to impose a very strong round of powerful tariffs, which would stop the bloodshed, I believe, very quickly. But for those tariffs to be effective, European nations, all of you are gathered here right now, would have to join us in adopting the exact same measures. I mean, you're much closer to this. We have an ocean in between. You're right there. And Europe has to step it up. They can't be doing what they're doing. They're buying oil and gas from Russia while they're fighting Russia. It's embarrassing to them, and it was very embarrassing to them when I found out about it, I can tell you that.
Now, I'm in the camp that there's definitely more that can be done on the economic sanctions front. We've certainly left some areas untapped. I think there's probably a lot more to be done if we go after China or India that are really helping to prop up the Russian war economy. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't take those steps for additional sanctions on Russia. I'm just not as confident maybe as the president is that those sanctions are going to lead to an end of the war, that they're actually going to strangle the Russian economy enough. This time it's going to be different. It's hard to see that at this point. The sanctions are doing work. The sanctions to a degree are effective, despite every time Russia does a really good job of constantly saying the sanctions don't matter. We don't care. They're not having any impact at all. Look at how strong we are growing without the international economy. And then every time a ceasefire is brought up or the end of the war, one of their key points is like, you got to drop sanctions, though. For sure. That has to be in there. So, yes, they are having an effect. No, they are not having a strong enough effect to end the war on their own. Now, one of the big topics, of course, has been why on earth does Europe continue to buy some of these Russian resources? And that was asked of the EU President Ursula von der Leyen in a one-on-one she had with President Trump later today, following the UN General Assembly session. And she laid out, like, look, we're actually pretty serious about this, and we're going to have to start laying down some sanctions and tariffs on the countries that continue to make these purchases. Quick note, that is Hungary, Slovakia, and France to a degree. But Hungary, Slovakia, way up there at the top in terms of the EU member states that are still buying Russian oil. Here's the EU president.
Madam President, how soon do you think that Europe can stop buying Russian oil and gas fully like President Trump has asked for?
Yeah, President Trump is absolutely right. We're on it. We have reduced already massively the gas supply from Russia, completely gotten out of Russian coal, and massively also reduced the oil supply, but there's still some coming to the European continent. So what we do now, we put sanctions out to those ports where, for example, LNG is coming from Russia. And we want to put tariffs on oil supplies that are still coming to the European Union. So we are really getting after the last bits of oil and gas coming from Russia to the European Union. We want to get rid of it.
Now, one of the challenges there is that at least a couple of these countries, Slovakia and Hungary, might not be all that interested in stopping to buy Russian oil. You know, they're a little bit not always in line with NATO when it comes to some of the stances against Russia. So President Trump was asked about this. Like, hey, you keep hammering on Europe to stop buying Russian oil. Have you thought about talking to the countries that are still buying it and maybe pressuring those guys? Here you go.
To President Orban, who is refusing to stop buying Russian oil?
Well, he's a friend of mine. I have not spoken to him, but I have a feeling if I did, he might stop, and I think I'll be doing that.
Look, I feel like there's a lot to take away from what happened at the United Nations earlier today. If you want to dig into the full speech that President Trump made, it's all over the place, and there was a lot that probably was not ideal, to say the least, in terms of U.S. foreign policy and our stature in the world now or going forward. But if we're strictly looking at it in a sense of what's happening with the war in Ukraine, how Europe is handling that, the U.S. approach to the war, I think there were a couple positive steps, especially the reaffirmation that we are committed to NATO. President Trump being relatively hawkish, saying he's on board with NATO shooting down Russian aircraft. I think those are some positive takeaways. Now, in President Trump's own words at the UN today, he said, harsh words do not end wars, action does. All we've heard today, to be clear, are words. The next step here for any of these things is to see if action actually follows. And that's what we'll keep an eye on here for the next couple days and weeks. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.